Welcome back, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the lunch. And so thanks again. My name is David Garcia. I'm the Policy Director at the Turner Center, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing the next conversation. So we're hearing a lot today from the researchers and the practitioners who are learning about and using different state policies to actually support the creation of new housing. This panel is really special because now we get to hear from the folks who are actively working to pass that kind of legislation. They have experience doing that in previous years and are continuing to do so in this legislative session. And so I'll go ahead and introduce this panel. We have Assemblymember David Alvarez from San Diego, Senator Catherine Blakespear from Orange County, Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco, and Assemblymember Buffy Wicks from Oakland. So I could not be more happy than to have all of these members with us here today to have this conversation, and also to have the esteemed Dillon from the Los Angeles Times to moderate this discussion. So thanks again, all of you, for being here, and look forward to this conversation. Liam, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Sounds great. Good afternoon, everyone. Looking forward to the talk. Let's just dive right in. I'm going to start, Senator Wiener, with a question for you. As the sort of old guard on the housing beat, if you will. So your Senate Bill 35, which streamlines approvals for housing developments in cities that are behind on their housing goals, was part of the first major package of housing legislation in recent years in 2017. And given that we're 6 years on from that now, I'm curious, what's something that you now know, either about the politics of housing in Sacramento or the ultimate efficacy of legislation, that you wish you knew when you first took office?
So when we introduced SB 35, I introduced it on the day I was sworn in December of 2016. It was right after Jerry Brown, that summer. I was a candidate at the time, and Jerry Brown, through the budget, tried to pass an amazingly broad streamlining law, and it created a SHIT storm throughout the state, and it ended up falling apart, but it was an important step. And so when we came in, I asked my staff, pull together all the opposition letters to the governor's plan, take all the reasonable ones, the constructive ones, and let's see what we can address. And so we did that with environmentalists, with labor, with cities, and that's how we came up with SB 35. And so it was not writing on a blank canvas. We didn't want to just come in and do exactly what the governor had done, which had just failed. We wanted to do something a little bit different. I think one of the big things that is different now, and I know a lot more about now, are the labor politics, because one of the things that has held parts of SB 35 back is the labor requirements for non 100% affordable housing, and that's why we're fixing that this year in SB 423 when as we extend SB 35, and so I think at the time I didn't fully appreciate what the limitation that would impose on part of the bill, and I'm really thrilled. I want to thank my colleague Ms. Wicks for helping lead the charge to try to really have a better dynamic with labor housing politics.
I should note we're going to take audience questions, so please, there should be cards on your table, so make sure that you fill them out. We'll have them later on. Senator Wicks, next one for you. Your AB 2011, which passed last year, took effect just last month, and it allows for by right development of mixed income projects on commercial corridors. Given what you know about what other housing bills have done, how are you going to define whether your bill is sort of practically successful? Is it like number of units, or is there another metric that you think is a better way to assess that?
Thank you for the question, and also thank you for the Turner Center for having us and putting on this great conference, and Liam, for your constant reporting on this. Appreciate it. And just for everyone in the room who is committed to solving this problem. I think all of us are. Maybe some of us take different approaches, but we know that this is the biggest crisis the state is facing. So appreciate everyone's work here, and have worked with a number of you and continue to want to do that. For me, the bottom line is like, are we producing housing units at all income levels? Are we producing low income, very low income, middle income, market rate, middle class housing, all of the above? And for me, that is the most important indicator on if the bill is working. And I've said this about SB 35 in testimony at Natural Resources Committee a month ago. It's been one of the most successful bills in California because producing housing for families and working class families who need it most. And so that is what I am focused on now with this bill. It just went into effect July 1st. Talking to a lot of different cities, talking to developers, talking to activists, and I want to know, this is an open invitation, what is working and what is not working with the bill. And if there are fixes that you all think we need to make it better, to make it more effective, I want to know, because I don't want to, I sort of ran my head into the meat grinder for about a year on that bill, which I'm happy to do, and it's part of the job. But I want to do that so that we actually produce housing, so that we solve our homelessness crisis, so that we ensure that families who live here who want to buy a home and build in their community and have families themselves have the ability to do so. So it really is, for me, numbers of housing units. How much are we building? Is it working? Are we doing it quickly? Is the CEQA bypassing and the ministerial approval, are those benefits that the developer gets if they pay prevailing wage, are those working? Is the inclusionary rate working? Is all of that stuff working to ultimately produce the number of housing units that we need? And when we did this bill, we actually had worked with a lot of great researchers, which was funded by Facebook, which I actually take Facebook on in other ways when I do regulation on social media stuff. But I was happy to have their partnership in the housing space. And they projected that it could potentially result in upwards of 2 million units, that bill. It opens up a lot of land that we need. It, again, bypasses CEQA and creates ministerial approval. So with that, can we do that? And there was a lot of questions around, okay, what do we put the inclusionary rate at? We want affordable housing, but we don't want it to be too high that it actually makes it something that's not useful and no one's ever going to use it. So where is that kind of sweet spot? So there was a lot of analysis going into that to understand, how do we create a vehicle that's actually going to be useful? So open invitation for you all, but ultimately it's number of units built. That's how I'm going to measure the success or failure of that bill, but I'm optimistic that we'll see, and we're starting to see applications come in on it.
So 1,000 a year good, 5,000 a year good, 10,000 a year, what's the...
Well, we need to build 3.5 million homes in California, about a million of those very low income, so I'd love to have 2011 be a piece of that solution.
So you're not going to give me a number?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Okay. We'll see where it goes, but I'm, and the last thing I'll say is, in Sacramento, and you've covered Sacramento a lot, we do a lot of bills in Sacramento. Not all of them are super effective, and some of them are just on the margins, and that's fine. I do a lot of my bills that are like, we're making change on the margins because that's what we can do. And then sometimes you kind of aim for the fences and see if you can get a bigger thing done. But for me, the follow-up on the implementation is as important, if not more, as actually passing the bill. Which again, I think why we're seeing Scott make some changes on SB 35. How do we make it more effective? And lawmakers should constantly be asking themselves that question. How do we make this more effective before they go on to the next shiny object thing, right? We want to make sure these things are effective.
Next question for Assembly Member Alvarez. Recent report from the Turner Center about the impact of SB 35 in terms of the number of units that was being produced statewide as a result. And they talked about how it hasn't been used very much in San Diego, where you're from, and theorized that the city already had its own streamlining programs that were more favorable to developers than SB 35 was. And so my question is, in what ways does your experience with the local government that has had its efforts in place to promote growth inform your perspective on what the debates are like on this issue in Sacramento?
Thank you, Liam. And thank you all again. I appreciate the invitation. I was a council member in the city of San Diego from 2010, 2018, and we did spend quite a significant amount of time, particularly during the 2014 to 2018 time frame, trying to do a lot of the work that Sacramento has done since. So, for example, on the ADU front, which is now seems to be one of the most successful things that have come out in terms of being able to create production. San Diego was definitely on the leading front of that years ago, and I think Sacramento has caught up to San Diego in many regards. And when it came to other policies and other regulatory reform, we took on a lot, as much as we could at the local level during those years, and I think that did help it make it a little bit easier. Density bonus, which is now a statewide program, initiated in San Diego with Circulate San Diego, which is one of the organizations that's here that's actually sponsoring another density bonus bill that I'm carrying this year on middle income. But it proved that the density bonus ordinance locally developed and created more housing opportunities. And so I think those experiences serve us well, especially those of us that come from coastal cities, where you often run into the things that you've heard about already today. Opposition from coastal cities, certainly Coastal Commission is an issue, and we need to deal with that. But there are opportunities from the local level to go above and beyond, and I think Sacramento in some way is acknowledging that and allowing locals to, step up to the challenge. And when locals aren't doing that, then Sacramento is saying we need to step in. So I think that's the way we need to continue to go forward. And two of the pieces of legislation that I have are really focusing in on that, because there are some communities that are just choosing not to take on this issue. And Sacramento, that's the appropriate role for us to take.
So just to follow up on that a little bit, I'm curious though about the politics of it, because a lot of the politics is the same, whether at a lot of it's different state level compared to local level, but a lot of it's the same too with respect to concern from neighborhood groups or for local control is a constant debate at every level of government, right? And so those kinds of debates were already happening in San Diego over these issues. Mm-hmm. How did what you learn from those debates translate to how you assess what housing policy is when you see bills come through and promote your own bills in the Capitol?
So San Diego, and I'm assuming other cities are likely, there's different pockets where you do have some of that opposition that you referred to. But what we were able to do, and it's a little bit different in the state because we don't really have a Republican presence as much as we did on the city council, was almost a split. So we worked in a bipartisan way and across segments of the city where I represented some of the most poor sections of the community where people need housing, and we saw the impact of homelessness, and other more affluent communities saw the need for housing as well. And so we were able to combine those forces. In Sacramento, kind of what Senator Wiener talked about, you find yourselves with different forces that sometimes come together. And what you're seeing is a lot of the coastal opposition is very real. And what needs to happen is that we need to make sure that they buy in and they participate in that conversation, that they're part of it, and that we also are mindful and respectful. I mean, you're not trying to impose everything on everybody, but the coastal areas need to participate. So I think what I've tried to do is try to engage folks who might see the world a little bit differently because they represent a coastal community that doesn't want to see development, but they really have to.
Senator Blakespear, turning to you. Before you came to the legislature, you were the mayor of a city, Encinitas, that had been one of the most notoriously anti-housing in the state. Never had a compliant state housing blueprint in decades, one of the very few cities that had that designation. So coming from where you did, how did you experience the spate of new housing laws as a local official first, and then how has that experience translated to how you see this issue in Sacramento?
Yes, well, thank you. Well, first I want to say thank you to the Turner Center for having us and the great work that you do on housing that the Turner Center does. And also that I'm on this panel with my esteemed colleagues in the legislature. They're all doing really great work, and I'm honored to have been invited now just 8 months into my service at the state level to be on this panel. So my name's Catherine Blakespear, and I represent northern coastal San Diego County, which is largely very NIMBY, and then also parts of southern Orange County. And so that district is, I think, notoriously, as is my previous city of Encinitas, very anti-housing. And so my challenge was, and I really embraced this, was to be a pro-housing mayor in an anti-housing city. And so doing that was really redefining what housing was. So instead of seeing it in terms of it being negative for people because it's adding to congestion and traffic and crowding and a degradation of their quality of life, redefining that and saying that housing is how we create opportunities for our seniors and our artists and our youth to live in our city and to be able to re-envision and reimagine us going forward, and that housing is a good, not a bad. So when I became the mayor in the city of Encinitas, we were embroiled in very expensive housing lawsuits with low-income housing developers. We had a big target on our back from HCD, and we had the state attorney general threatening to sue us. So there were endless community meetings, and I was always fielding the rhetoric of the anti-housing perspective, that we don't need to become urban, that we're a suburban city that should be able to stay this way, that Sacramento is breathing down our throats all the time. And so I think part of the struggle, but also part of what's necessary, is to recognize that these big societal problems we have, like homelessness and our affordability crisis, are really created because we have leaned into the rhetoric and the perspective of those who don't want housing. Many cities have. And so I really see the RHNA process, which is in California, a regional housing needs assessment process for those who aren't here from California, which is an obligation for every city to provide housing at every income level. I really see that as very much a win. There's a lot of negative rhetoric about it, but it requires an obligation for every city to do something. And so right now, my perspective on homelessness is we're not doing that. So cities, it's optional for 500 plus cities to decide whether they want to do something on homelessness or not. But when we talk about affordable housing, we do have obligations for every city to zone for housing at lower income levels, which is essentially high density housing. And so to me, it seems like the things that the state has done, while as a local elected, I really found it extremely unpleasant, I also recognized that it was really important to solve big problems. So coming out of a local government process, I came into office reflecting my community, but as all good legislators and people who are thinking do, you evolve when you see what the data is showing you. So the data is really showing us that our housing crisis is a major component to all of the other crises we have in California, and if we want to solve it, we have to really focus on that. So I did evolve as a policymaker over my 8 years in local office and came into the state legislature as unapologetically pro-housing, and I've been working on that as well for the last 8 months.
I'm curious, what kind of calls you're getting from city council members in Encinitas? So they say, we know you, like, how could you be doing this to us? Like, I mean, is there like what kind of conversations do you have with the locals in your district and even some of your former colleagues about some of the legislation?
Well, I think like in many honest conversations, you're saying, I might not be with you 100% on this, but on these other issues, we are on the same page. So on housing, I am pro-housing, and I want to help communities do it in the way that's the most acceptable to them. So accessory dwelling units, I really leaned into those at a local level because it scatters density in a gentle density type way that's much less of a problem than like a big apartment complex on the corner. And so we know that we need all types of housing, but being able to really lean aggressively into the parts that we could have a few more homes in a few more neighborhoods and really make a big difference, which we did do in our community. I think that was one of the ways that I tried to manage that, was to really focus on the areas that seemed like they would have the least opposition.
So questions now will sort of be open to the group, and hopefully we can get a good conversation going. When people ask you, what is an example of a particular piece of legislation to increase supply that made a meaningful difference in reducing housing prices or making housing more affordable, especially in a high interest area? How do you respond to that? Can you provide an example of that?
Well, so I think for people who follow housing policy closely, I'm best known for SB 35 and also for SB 827 and SB 50, our effort to rezone the entire state of California. Called Swinging for the Rafters. But actually, the most impactful housing bill that I was able to passed into law was one that I think, I don't, maybe you covered it at one point, but it might have gotten zero press coverage, or maybe just a little bit from Liam and no one else. And that was Senate Bill 828, which I authored at the same time that I was swinging for the rafters, and it was very wonky. Bill got very, very little attention, and it basically restructured the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs allocation, and basically dramatically increased what cities have to plan and zone for. And so San Francisco went from having the plan for 27,000 new homes over an 8-year period to having the plan for 82,000. Beverly Hills went from 2 over 8 years to 3,000, I think. LA got, I got the exact number.
Significant number.
Just like all the just dramatic increases, and it's been painful, but healthy painful. And cities are now zoning for dramatically more density, and it's in significant part because of Senate Bill 828 that got no attention. And that has effectively helped facilitate massive rezoning in the state of California. And once you put it in your housing element, which are required to do, there's all sorts of streamlining that kicks in, and other pro-housing policies. So that's, and so it's another example of sometimes the best work you do, the strongest work you do, gets no attention. But as long as you know, that's all that matters. So.
Just quickly, the headline on my one story, I think I wrote one story on that bill. The headline was, "This little-known bill may change housing in California."
Yeah.
So,
see, this is why we miss you, Liam.
Yeah.
In Sacramento.
Right.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with my Senate colleague. I like one of his other bills better, which is SB 35, because it's produced the most units than any other bill, I think, in the last 6-7 years, I think. But that speaks to a broader thing. I think you're asking, like, we want to see results, right? Like, people want to see results on this issue.
Right.
And I think in the last 6 or 7 years, the legislature has answered the call to say, okay, we need structural change on this issue from the state, which we didn't do that really prior to that time. You know, Gavin's been great in terms of, the governor has been great in terms of really pushing this as well. He's invested significant resources. People like Scott have really paved the way for people like us following in Scott's footsteps to take on and tackle tough things. So I think we've created a much better sort of streamlined policy environment. There's still a lot of work to do, but I think we've started to really kind of tackle some of these like sacred cows in a way that we hadn't really done prior to about 6 or 7 years ago. SEEK was one of those things that I think we need to have continued work on. There's still work to be done, but we've really opened up, I think, a lot of conversation. We've had really hard conversations around labor standards. We've really kind of dove into the deep end on some of this stuff and have made a lot of substantive changes. What we still need, I think, is money. So I think that's another big question. Obviously, we can't control things like interest rates or supply chain issues, right? But we can make a better policy environment to create a better environment for building more housing. The challenge, though, is I do think it's like, and Liam and I were talking about this, it's like sort of steering a battleship, like turning a battleship. It takes a while for this stuff to get implemented. It takes a while to see what's working. It takes a while to make the changes that you need. But I do think the politics have shifted on this issue because of the dire need for housing that we see in so many of our communities. From people of all walks of life, I think, are starting to really internalize and understand that. I think because of the leadership of Scott and others, and new members like these two lovely human beings who are jumping into the fire and saying, okay, we need to do this. So I'm actually like cautiously optimistic that things like 423, things like 2011, 330, Nancy Skinner's bill, like once this stuff is all really in fully effect, that we are gonna see some more substantive real changes that are like outcome-based for us to try to fix this problem.
I would say, you know, I am getting a little concerned because I do think the state has done tremendous, and certainly Senator and Assembly member here on the end in the last couple of years have led the charge. I just had a meeting on Sunday with San Diego Organizing Project. You might remember them. They're the organizing in faith-based communities, and you know the top issue is housing. And we're talking about just how difficult it's getting for people to live, and they're doubling up, and all these stories which are very, very real. And you're seeing them in the communities that I represent, which are like the low-income communities of places like Barrio Logan, which were like the poorest places of San Diego, and now have become completely out of reach for everybody. And what I'm concerned about is, while there's been all this work, like how quickly are these things going to come together? Because at some point, I'm concerned that what we're having are the folks who can really afford this very expensive housing, and then the subsidized, amount that we can put out there through bonds, through requirements, which is still not enough. And then what about the middle folks, right? And one of the bills that I have, and I appreciate the support of Senator and Assembly Member, is focus on middle income, creating some density bonus for middle income folks, which I think we need to do more work around, because we've got to make sure that people of all income levels, as was stated, actually have a chance to stay in the state. And I am getting concerned that we're not producing enough to keep up with the demand, and that will lead to something much more drastic in terms of what our state will look like, who will live here, and who will be able to actually afford to live a decent life in California.
Just to push Senator Wiener, I mean, you discussed a bill that does a lot to change zoning rules and planning for housing. But my question was specifically related to you can't say that bill reduced housing costs, right, in a high interest area. Where can we point to? It doesn't have to be in California, but where can we point to some legislation that you think?
Well, I think on that, a lot of that zoning has just gone into effect, but
right.
Also that zoning combined with SB 35, because SB 35 provides that if you are not meeting your goals, your Wiener goals, you become streamlined. So no discretion, no CEQA, and so forth. And so that's why I think with how we're retooling SB 35 with SB 423, so many numbers, we're making it more usable more broadly. And so SB 35, all these housing laws start really slow. The first year SB 35 was in effect, we were like, is anyone going to use it? It's really no one's using it, and then it started accelerating. Because of how it's designed, it was overwhelmingly, I think 2/3 or 3/4 of the units are below market rate. 3,400 in San Francisco alone that utilized SB 35. So we're seeing those tangible deliverables that I think will accelerate, and I think those two laws together in combination with all these others, I think we're going to see a continued acceleration. We did see an increase last year. We went up to 125,000 new homes produced. That was the largest number in a long time. I think we're maybe slipping a little bit, but I think we're going to start seeing an acceleration.
And just to answer the question, to me it seems like one of the biggest changes at the state level has been the idea that housing production, housing zoning is not discretionary and up to every city to just determine on their own. And I frequently think about the other things that we do in local government. Like, for example, we don't leave it up to local communities whether they want to pay their property taxes, or whether we want to have a public school system, or whether we want to have investments in our roads. There are numbers of things that we have set up as required. And so there's been a really difficult shift, which we're still going through, to make housing similar to some of these other things, which we basically, from a higher level, are saying has to happen. And the pushback from local communities who don't want to see any changes to their community. And in many ways, if you made the decision at a higher level and a project goes in, there really isn't that much change, if any, to their community, but they fear that there would be. And so recognizing that if we can make decisions at a higher level, you actually can get there a lot faster, and it will have a positive impact on that community as well as on the entire state.
I have a real-world example about an impact of some of these laws that were passed. 100 of them, I think, was the Turner Report said, since 2017. And I just wrote about this last week, and I think it's instructive, so I'll give a little bit of a narrative about it. So I wrote about a developer here in Los Angeles who is pushing the envelope by using many of these beefed-up state laws, relying heavily on density bonus. He has a claim for the builder's remedy, which is essentially allows developers to build whatever they want when the city's out of compliance with the housing plans that we've been discussing. And what he's been doing is buying up single-family homes with the intention of tearing them down and building dozens of apartments where essentially the city's hands in many respects, City of LA's hands in many respects are tied, and it's much harder for the city to say no. And so I talked with, there's 3 sort of big projects he's doing across the city, and I talked with neighbors in each of these areas. Some of the objections from neighbors I heard were, and I'll quote entirely the first one, quote, when you're taking single-family homes and replacing them with big apartment buildings, the residents and the tenants of those apartments are coming from different backgrounds. The different backgrounds could be criminal backgrounds. So that was one objection. In the second area, also in the San Fernando Valley, there was some concern that the apartment project the developers promoting would override local zoning rules that require sufficient space for horse stables. So homes for horses required in that part of the city. And then third was the fact that a complex that he is proposing in an area that's certainly gentrifying, District West Adams, that complex would have such narrow setbacks with an above-ground parking garage that the exhaust vent from the garage would be less than 10 feet from the small apartments next door, which I think perhaps many of us could agree is an entirely separate kind of concern from the first two that were raised. And what I think is instructive about this example is that it shows in many respects how these state laws can sort of flatten the reasons to say no to a project, right? That some people might think some of them are good or some of them are bad. And again, a long preamble to the question of how do you think through, as you're writing this legislation, both the intended and unintended consequences of these laws?
Go, Scott.
No, I mean, listen, so the way we've set up housing policy in California is that cities, sometimes the state, but we set up all these rules. Here are the 15 rules you have. This is how tall the building can be. This is how dense the building can be. This is the setbacks. These are the design standards. Here is the checklist of everything you need to do. Here are the rules. And then someone comes forward and says, okay, I have a project. I met all the rules that you set out, every single one. I'm not asking for an exception. I'm asking, here's my checklist. It's all completed. Normally, in the world, in any kind of like system of good government, the answer is, great, here's your permit. Thank you for following the rules that we, the people, set out. Here's your permit. No, not in California. That just gets you in the door that now you can go in the gladiator games. Now you are eligible to go through a chaotic, unpredictable, politicized process. Maybe your project will get approved, maybe it'll get rejected, maybe it'll get chopped in half, maybe they'll come up with new design standards that no one had ever articulated before that make your project infeasible. It is the absolute worst kind of government. And it's unfair, and it's helped generate this crisis. And so my philosophy in doing state housing legislation is to say we need to have knowable rules ahead of time, mostly set locally, but some by the state, those are enacted into law, and then if you comply with them, you get your permit, period. And it is because of the chaos of the system we have that has led to some of these issues. No one wants to, I mean, some people want the builder's remedy to kick in, but most people don't want the goal is for the builder's remedy not to kick in, so that you can have random person proposing something that most people think doesn't make sense. Even pro-housing people think doesn't make sense. But that only happens because of the chaos that we've allowed to happen, and we have allowed cities to get away with not passing compliant housing elements because we didn't do anything for a long time. And by the way, my city is one of the worst offenders. It's not just about Encinitas. San Francisco has a horrific track record and continues to have a horrific track record today. And finally, we say enough. And does that mean we can't predict every single project or every single situation where you could have an event that's right by someone? That sounds to me more like a health and safety building code issue. But at some point, you just have to set down rules that people follow.
My simple rule would be until we have more unintended consequences than intended consequences, I think the passing legislation like this continues to make sense. And you have to acknowledge that it will be change, and it will be change that people are unhappy with. And that's the job that we have to take on. But as long as we are continuing and that particular policy continues to build more housing, I think that's, in the end, a good thing. If there are unintended consequences that outnumber that, then our job, as Senator Wicks just mentioned earlier, is to go back and fix it. And we learn from that, and we try to make it better. But people are going to be unhappy with whatever change you make to the way things are today. And if you're someone who's afraid of people being unhappy about that, then you shouldn't be in the business of policymaking, because that's what's going to happen.
I think one of the things that came up in the earlier session in the morning, which I thought was a really good point, is how much public engagement and involvement to have, and what is the right balance. Because we obviously do need a system where the local communities are involved. And to me, it seems like it makes sense to have it happen at that planning process at the beginning, at a more macro level of planning. And then to Senator Wiener's point, there are certain rules that are laid out that you would get to build based on following those rules. So it takes the discretion out of it. But that also there's more certainty around the litigation risk, which is substantial under CEQA, but then just otherwise. And also the number of public hearings and the influence of the Coastal Commission particularly, which is an absolute complete free-for-all. So there's almost no certainty if you're in the coastal zone how many additional studies the Coastal Commission will ask a developer to do, and all sorts of things that lead to this incredible delay for projects anywhere near the coast. And so to me, all of those things are areas where we need more legislation to tighten things up so that it is a more certain process.
You asked about sort of unintended consequences in the policymaking process, and going back to as I was putting together AB 2011, and my theory on policymaking in general is I will meet with anyone and everyone who wants to talk about this issue, right? As chair, and we did meetings, obviously a ton of different meetings with labor. The EJ groups had a lot of thoughts on this. The advocates, we met with the League of Cities multiple times. We met with local, smaller cities, urban, ex-urban, suburban, also the big city mayors. I mean, at one point, we run, 15, 20 bills a year. Don't tell my other bill groups that I was doing this, but I was spending about 40 hours a week on this one bill, right? And I said, I have a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and AB 2011, right? That's my third child. But with these types of bills, you kind of have to spend that much time and energy in them. But so it was meetings with everyone. I mean, Livable California, if you want to meet with me, I will meet with you, And the thing with Livable California or groups like that.
Tell people who they are.
They're a NIMBY, statewide NIMBY organization. I mean, they are, and the thing is, what they say the unintended consequence, i.e. more homes, is my intended consequence. That is actually what I'm trying to do, So I will take into account, and I'm using them as an example, right, of everyone's positions, but in the end of the day, as chair of housing, I'm not going to preside over inertia and status quo because that is not working for our communities right now. And what is driving me, and I think all of us every single day, is how do we stop the fact that we have 174,000 homeless people on our streets every single day? So I think it's important to listen to folks. I think it's very important to meet with all different stakeholders. And I will say, I learn a lot from those stakeholders. And we made some changes the League of Cities wanted because I felt like that's doable, that doesn't conflict with what I'm trying to do. If I can get more cities to buy into the process by doing that, I will do it. But in the end of the day, I think it's how do we continue to drive for the common purpose, which in my opinion is solving this housing crisis and making it easier to build, even though, as Mr. Alvarez said, it is uncomfortable for some people.
I have a couple political questions. I think we were kind of heading in that direction anyway. Lots of interest groups, if you all have referred to, involved in housing debates, local government, labor, tenant groups, environmental groups, developers, realtors. It seemed, from my perspective, when I was covering these types of legislation around 2016, 2017, the biggest fights were about local control arguments, and then it definitely extended to labor fights for years. And this year, from my sort of outside reading of things, there seems to have been a large debate about the role of the Coastal Commission with your bill, Senator Wiener, and perhaps others. And so how would you rank where the biggest fault lines between interest groups are now, and how you think that these fights have evolved over the years?
I'll jump in first, and I just want to acknowledge the work already has been acknowledged on AB 2011. It was the first bill I proudly co-authored last year, and I think it really define the future of the conversation as it relates, at least currently, these things always evolve, but as it relates to labor standards. And I think that's where, the bills that I have that touch that, a carbon copy of the language in 2011, and I think that's where perhaps that's headed. Coastal certainly is a huge issue. They almost killed one of the bills that I had, obviously attempted to do the same with Senator Wiener, and I think we still have a lot of work to do so that those cities participate in our housing solutions. And I'm looking forward to next year's work around coastal. I think that's where it's going to be.
I would largely agree with that. I mean, my hope is that with what transpired last year and with this year in 423, that we are moving into a better place and a mutual understanding around what the labor standards will be in housing. That was not an easy process. I don't know if all the stakeholders agree with that assessment or not, but that is certainly my hope, that that is no longer going to be the biggest barrier to housing anymore. I do think the coastal issue was raised a lot in 423 and continues to be. I will say one thing that I would love to see happen is I'd love to see the environmental community more at the table on trying to be supportive of infill housing and be in the forefront of trying to ensure that we're working towards solution. That means building more housing. And I know the environmental community is not monolithic and there's a lot of different sort of actors in there. But I'm a big believer we need more infill development. And I've talked to organizations like the Sierra Club and others about this. I want them to be helping lead the charge on that conversation around we need more infill, right? Let's protect our open spaces, but then let's build more infill development. And the nexus between our transportation policy and our housing policy is our climate change policy. And we have to view those things as really interconnected. And so my hope is that the environmental community will come to the table more so to be leaders in that space, because I think there's ample opportunity for them to do so.
Yeah, I want to just reiterate what Assemblymember Wicks said about the environmental community. I think probably have a very, very high scorecard from all the major environmental scorecards, and so something I care deeply about. And housing is a climate issue, and the environmental movement. Not everyone. I don't want to broad brush, but big swaths of the environmental movement have had a massive blind spot for housing for many, many years. For many years, major environmental organizations were opposing housing bills. Not all. Cal Enviro voters, Natural Resources Defense Council were actually supporting some bills, but they were the exception, not the rule. And then we saw the environmental movement basically, I think, just sort of steer clear for years of housing policy because it was really hard and controversial and they had enough fights on their plate. But then when we had our dispute with the Coastal Commission on SB 423, all of a sudden 50 environmental organizations go and oppose the bill because the Coastal Commission put out the alarm. And in Ms. Wicks' committee, I publicly called them out and said, where were you when we were fighting in San Francisco for the Stevenson Street project to have 500 units of housing right by a BART station? You can't just say no in the coastal zone and then be AWOL when we're trying to build what everyone would agree is the most environmentally sustainable kind of housing. And so I want to see the environmental movement really step up in a bigger way. Thanks to the work of Ms. Wicks and the work that we've done in 2011 and then 423, I think we're in a much better place on labor standards. We'll see in the next year or two if the deal holds, but hopefully we've moved past that. I think on the coastal zone, we have reached a compromise with the Coastal Commission. I think we were close at the last hearing, and we've now, I think, gotten there. And I'm hoping that that'll be a template to say that, of course, no one wants to be pushing development into like coastal bluffs and wetlands and like these environmentally sustainable coastal resources. No one, or very few people, want that. But when you talk about Santa Monica and Santa Cruz and Los Angeles and all these communities that are urbanized existing cities that happen to be partially in the coastal zone, they should not be excluded from state housing law. And so I think we've reached a good resolution. But one area that we have not made progress on is wildfires. And we are seeing, unfortunately, abuse of CAL FIRE's severity fire maps, the low, medium, high, very high. People are interpreting that as you're not allowed to build in the high and the very high. And if CAL FIRE was sitting here, I think they would tell you no. Those maps are designed not to say where you can build and not build, but rather what you have to do if you're building in those zones and building to a higher standard. But we have people who are opposed to new housing, that people change their hats and the arguments that they make. All of a sudden, no, we don't want any new construction, or we don't want state housing law to apply at all in very high or high wildfire severity zones, which, given what's happening with climate change, will wipe out big swaths of the state from state housing law. That's completely unacceptable. And we need to come up with more of a consensus about these issues, because the wildfire issue is going to become a bigger and bigger issue in state housing policy.
And I'll just add to this question. The question was
About
about
interest groups, yeah.
the fault lines and
Yes.
the interest groups. And I completely agree with what has been said, and I won't repeat it, but I just want to add that when I look forward at the entire housing picture, I think one of the things that we are taking as a premise is that the private market provides housing. And I guess I would say that from my perspective, we need a radical insertion of the public sector into the creation of more housing. Because when you look at what our overall economy and the places where we're having market failures, we have about a third of the state is on Medi-Cal, which means they're poor. And all of our housing inclusionary ordinances are at most, they're 10% or 15% affordable. And so we're not, we are just not in any scale meeting the need to provide housing that's affordable. There's no county in California where somebody with a minimum wage job can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So, the reality that people are going to need subsidized homes, and that we are not providing them at anywhere near the volume that we need to me indicates that we need to be thinking more seriously about some of these ideas about social housing or scattered site public housing, or some of the things that add in the public sector actually building the housing. Not providing the grants for the private sector to build the housing, but actually building the housing themselves. And I don't think I know this is not being talked about widely in Sacramento or from advocacy groups or other legislators a lot. There's an occasional social housing bill, but I do feel like if we're really going to be serious about housing, in the past, in the 1980s and before that, we did build public housing in this country, and we've really gotten away from doing that, and I think we need to do that. The pendulum needs to swing back a bit. So I would say that that's another area that I would see as a potential features.
Just quickly, I want to get to 2 more questions before the audience, but so quickly, yeah.
I was just going to add to that, the funding issue is huge. And it's less political, but it is always political, right? And in California, we don't really have ongoing, sustained, substantial funding every year in the budget. And when you say your budget or your values, that doesn't exist in California. The governor's done great work in the last couple of years towards that end. But I would love to see like a mini Prop 98 for housing, a 10-year fund, 5% set aside, $100 billion that we need to actually crawl our way out of this. I tried to run that bill last year, but couldn't get it through. But something to that effect of the funding piece, I think, is critical. Once we got rid of redevelopment, you talk to any of the local cities, that was the way that they funded a lot of this. So the funding, I think, is another big thing we need to continue to work on.
Quickly on this question. So Senate Bill 9 was a bill that passed a few years ago that effectively ended single-family zoning in California. A lot of lift politically, a big symbolic change in terms of sort of what I just said, but little in the way from what the results have shown of any actual housing production from this bill. Whereas there were a battery of bills, starting 2016, 2017 to make it easier to build ADUs or casitas or these smaller structures on lots that were single-family lots. And that legislation had a lot less heat and light surrounding it. In fact, some of the original drafters of these bills said that was on purpose to sort of keep it under the radar. But they've been a lot more effective at spurring housing production. And from your folks' perspective, what does that sort of dichotomy say about the kind of bills that you want to be running and how you want to be judging them?
I respectfully disagree with that dichotomy. Our ADU law has been in effect since the early 1980s. It was a dead letter for a long time, and the legislature started to close the loopholes and strengthen it, I think in 2015 or 16, right before I got there. And so it took a few years to methodically close the loopholes. And so it used to be there were not that many ADUs in the big scheme of things being produced. But over the last 7 years, that has changed because the loopholes have been closed. SB 9 went into effect in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. It was passed in 21. I can't recall if it went into effect January 1st or July 1st, I don't remember, but so a year and a half in effect. I don't think you can compare that to ADU law, which has been around for a long time and started to be strengthened 7 years ago. I do think that SB 9, which is a brand new paradigm for California, forcing duplex, fourplex zoning on cities that often didn't want it. It's going to, just like the ADUs, have to be probably cleaned up and strengthened, loopholes closed. I think it's way too early to draw that kind of assessment. That's my take.
I'll just add to, I think that there's a big difference between converting your garage into a living space and building a quad on your property. Just the reality of needing to live in it for 3 years, of it being development cost and complexity that's creating individual homeowners as mini developers. I think that the barriers to entry are just higher. And so we did see some of the financing around ADUs as being a problem that, but the reality is a number of homeowners could actually just afford to make those changes. And when the local governments were prohibited from limiting the ability to do that, you did really see them take off. So I think having some improvements to SB 9 that made it easier will create more activity in that area, but it is at a higher level than a garage conversion, which is what a lot of the ADUs in the state of California were.
I'll move to some, I'll reserve my last question to see if I have time for it, but I'll head to some of the audience questions. First one, as we see significant turnover in the legislature due to term limits or perhaps other reasons in the next few years, some of the folks who have been, I guess, some of the biggest veterans of these housing debates are terming out. What challenges are you most concerned about, and how are you thinking about addressing those challenges?
Well, it makes me sad. I mean, after next year, we're losing Tony Atkins. We're losing Nancy Skinner. Nancy Skinner has been a total mentor to me on housing, as has Senator Atkins. So those are two, in the Senate, two major like forces around housing who are terming out. And I'm sure if I went around both houses, there are others as well. So, but we have great new members coming in, like the two folks to my right here, and there are others as well. And actually, a few years ago, we had to shrink the housing committee. We shrunk it from 9 to 7 because fewer people wanted to be on it. There are certain committees that everyone wants to be on, and certain committees, including some really important ones like public safety, that very few people want to be on. And this year we had to, we the pro tem expanded the committee because a whole bunch of people wanted to be on the committee. So I think we have more in both houses.
And as someone I'm in my 5th year, we can do up to 12 years, so I'm sort of midway through. I think it's incumbent upon those of us that are in these leadership roles now to really help build up and lift up the next level of leadership in the space. And that's part of the job of being a chair of this committee, in my opinion. I think David Alvarez is a new member in my body that I'm super excited about his leadership. Juan Carrillo is great. When I met with him first, when he was still a candidate, all he wanted to do was talk about the ins and outs of AB 2011. Like he knew the bill better than I did, and this is someone who wasn't in office yet. Chris Ward is one of our newer members. We have a lot of really good members, I think, and so it's important that we build up that. And obviously we have new leadership in the Assembly as well with Rob Rivas, who is my class, and he was a co-author of 2011. He's been a fighter on farm worker housing, and so I'm actually excited about the opportunity. There's some members yet where we'll see, we're going to have SB 423 on the floor in the Assembly soon, so we'll see where kind of people land on some of these issues. But I think it's important for us who are in these leadership roles to really spend the time to build up the leadership of the next generation of folks who will be coming after us, because we want to make sure that they are successful in the work that they are doing.
If I could, I do just want to call out Assemblymember Chris Ward, who I think has been sort of a little more understated in his work, but has been doing really good work. And is, when we had a really, really rough hearing for SB 423 in Assembly Natural Resources, and we had a dispute with the chair, and Assemblymember Ward was just so rock solid. He's also working now he's trying to bridge housing and enviros, and so working with California YIMBY and a group of environmental organizations to try to produce a bill to forge some templates around housing and environmental protection. I also want to just mention Jesse Gabriel, who came in, I think, frankly, a little nervous about housing. He represents a challenging. I think one of those builders remedies quotes that you read is from his district, and so. But he has just continually gotten more vocal and stronger and stronger and stronger, and is now carrying some really powerful housing bills. And so there are also members who've been around for a while who maybe started out not so focused on it and then got really focused on it. So I'm optimistic.
Another audience question. Let's say instead of being legislators, you were the Attorney General. What would your top enforcement priority be in state housing law?
I would sue San Francisco. I've said that publicly before, and I'll just say it again.
I mean, Beverly Hills is also on the list. Yeah, I mean, I give a lot of praise to the AG. Rob has just done such really good work. The Housing Strike Force, I think is what he's calling it, has just been fantastic, and I love to see the AG's involvement in this enforcement. So I love all the work that he's doing.
I want to go back to the previous question because neither of the newbies got to answer it as far as what you see as some of the challenges or opportunities as there's turnover from folks who have been involved in these debates.
I think there are real challenges. As someone who is still relatively young and was often youngest on the council in San Diego, it's odd to say this, but I'm from a local government perspective. Not everybody comes with that experience to Sacramento, and that worries me in the housing front. They come with other experience, which is good, and the body is supposed to be reflective of a multitude of experiences, but on the housing, planning, zoning, those types of conversations, some folks just have never been part of those conversations. So that is the challenge. But then I look to the folks who just got sworn in December, and they're at least a solid half a dozen. Juan Carrillo was mentioned, planning background, council member, former council member Soria from Fresno, very experienced on local issues. Valencia from Orange County, Pacheco from Downey. There are a handful of folks who actually have that experience. So I feel really okay about the assembly. I'm not as aware as the backgrounds in the Senate, but.
Yeah, and I'll just say, that we do have some real heavyweights. Two of them are here to my left that are doing incredible work. And I am very much a student and an observer of what makes them so successful, because politics is the art of the possible. And in Sacramento, it's quite different from local government. So, and the reality of the relationships and the layers of relationships with your locals, and then also with the organizations that are in Sacramento alone, and then why things do or don't get derailed. I mean, there's just a lot of nuance to it. So, I mean, I think we will see the next generation of housing leaders as some of these people are terming out. But we also, I mean, the idea that you kind of put your nose in and keep pushing until you get somewhere, housing and homelessness is a top crisis in our state. And there are many people, and you just poll the population and homelessness is the top issue. So, we know that there needs to be attention here, and especially because housing and transportation policy, our climate policy, as was said, that these are things that you're going to continue to have a number of voices on. Where it exactly comes from my observation of the first 8 months, I don't know. But it does seem to me like the people who are elected are very smart and engaged, care a lot, work hard, and that we will have those leaders emerge.
So we've been talking for the last hour about state actions to increase housing supply, and also all the bills that you've written, and the more than 100 that have been done over the past 6 years. But I think if you ask the average person on the street, like how things are different from 2017 to today, I think just about everybody would say things are worse. homelessness is up, rents are up. By many metrics, it's harder to buy a home now. So what does all that say about the efficacy of what it is that you folks have been doing the past 6 years?
This is one of the reasons I love you, Liam. You're definitely not a glass half full guy.
I mean, he's a reporter. That's his job.
True.
Yeah.
So it took us 50 years to dig into this hole. It was in the 70s that cities started to downzone, that CEQA was passed and then promptly expanded to areas having nothing to do with the environment. It was in 1985 that Los Angeles downzoned and deleted 1/2 of its own housing capacity all in one fell swoop. San Francisco did it in the late 70s, early 80s. So this has been going on for a long, long time. And the idea, and so what is happening now with homelessness and people being pushed out and 5 families living in one home together, which we saw a microscope on during COVID, with all of this is the fruits of 50 years of horrific, horrible housing policy. And so to suggest that we would, I would love to solve that in 5 years. That would be amazing. But even if I think the laws that we're passing, laws don't build homes. Laws create the atmosphere and plant the seeds so that homes can be built going forward. And it never happens as quickly as we want. Maybe with manufactured homes in the future, it'll happen more quickly, but that industry is not nearly at scale. So I don't agree that, well, it's not been successful because we haven't solved it in 5 years. We are seeing, when you look at some of the improvements to every project in California now is using the density bonus, I think, and that's when we passed a number of changes, density bonus, and that's great. SB 35 is getting used, ADU production is ramping up, but it's going to take a while, and that's to fix. And that's one of the really hard things about politics, to say, trust me, if we do this hard thing in 10 years or 12 years or 15 years, we can really move the dial. That's a hard thing to say politically, but it's really about long-term thinking.
And I think the sentiment that you just expressed is something that probably all of us wake up with every morning and think about.
Or your constituents will tell you every time.
Exactly. I mean, every Thursday when we come home, well, I come home every night, but these guys go home every Thursday. Every weekend, what their constituents tell them and us is homelessness, housing, affordability, working class families struggling. I mean, all the stats and the stories, every day, that's what we hear about. It's the number one thing people call into our office. And are we moving fast enough? No, because there's still the problem. But does it give us motivation to keep working hard, working with everyone in this room so we can solve this problem? Absolutely. And so I think you have a number of committed folks who are ready to do that, who want to do that, and who are committed to doing it while we have this job for this very short period of time.
I frequently challenge constituents who talk about any issues and say, okay, how would you solve it? What's your idea? Because and I try to do that in a real way to engage with them, because people often do think that it's just simple. You just do one thing, and it's not. It's all the things that have been done. It's the 100 laws plus that have been passed and more that need to get passed so that we can continue to streamline. We need to finance. We need to do something on redevelopment, because that was the way. I got to see that as a council member pre and post, and how we were able to build a ton of housing, invest in communities that aren't receiving the investment. There's more work to be done for sure.
Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say in California, the estimate is that we need to be building 350,000 homes a year, and we're building on a good year 100,000. Yeah. And SB 35 has statewide produced 18,000 over 5 years. So, that's 18,000 that without SB 35, we wouldn't have. And so the idea that we're not there yet doesn't mean the things we've done haven't done good. And so to me, it seems like we need to keep pushing. We need more systems level change. It's not just about money or about suggesting that all the systems level change has happened. I definitely don't think it has. But I think the good work that's been done has created the reality that we're very focused on it, and that there are all these bills every year that are trying to get at this core problem.
Can I say one last thing?
Quickly,
I hope we'll have a conversation, or you will, and we will in the future. Displacement is a real issue. People who currently live in communities where we are having some success with building housing, that's a real issue. The increase of cost of living as a result of that, it's real, and it's something that I'm concerned about, and I hope that we can start to have a conversation about that as well. We got to figure out how do we don't just build housing that then becomes, still affordable but more expensive than what it was, and then those folks are having a difficult time, and we are seeing those people then transition to living in vehicles and then on the street. In my case, because I'm at the border, people moving to Mexico and commuting every single day across the border, I don't know what they're doing in other places in the state, but at least we have that safety valve down there. But displacement, I think we cannot forget it as a real impact and something we need to do for housing solutions.
All right, please join me in thanking our panel.